Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of web pages. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by James Reed, who wrote one of the response essays for our March 2021 forum on John C. Calhoun. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors from this forum or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. James Reed is professor and chair of political science at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University of Minnesota. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard University in 1988. He is the author of 3 books, Power versus Liberty, Madison, Hamilton, Wilson, and Jefferson, Doorstep Democracy, Face-to-Face Politics in the Heartland, and Majority Rule versus Consensus, the Political Thought of John C. Calhoun, as well as numerous articles and book chapters in the fields of political theory and American political thought. He's currently writing a book titled Sovereign of a Free People, Abraham Lincoln, Majority Rule, and Slavery. James, it's a great pleasure to have you here at the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to both you and also Thea Burris for doing the logistics for this.
Thea is the wind beneath my wings. I'm not sure what I would do without her, and she's an outstanding person, and I appreciate you calling the viewers' attention to her. I would like to give her a big shout out as well, so thank you. James, one of the things we've talked about throughout the interviews, and I really think throughout this essay process, has been this sort of what is the philosophical goal? What's the underlying goal of Calhoun's attempt to what he says is amplify the Madisonian system? So I think there's a back and forth among you, certainly between you and some of the other folks, about exactly whether that's his goal or whether it's a radically different goal. But one thing that he does seem to want to talk about is whether or not this is a system that's going to create compromise and going to create deal making, or whether it's simply going to lead to gridlock. And I wanted to start by asking, is the Madisonian, or was, I guess in our sense, is the Madisonian system now, or was it ever intended to be one that was designed to create compromise, or was it one that was simply to diffuse power and sort of create a kind of a gridlock? And is that something that we need to keep in mind when we have these kinds of discussions?
Well, because I wrote on Madison in my first book and in other articles, so I've thought a lot about this. I don't see either Madison or Calhoun as aiming for gridlock. They all, both of them, in different ways, wanted and depended upon government action. They were, I'll just switch quickly to Calhoun, because the gridlock issue is much more, pressing for Calhoun, because he advocated nullification, that any interest, any minority interest, or at least those interests that count, could block any action. And so the question of gridlock, or worse, anarchy, perhaps even civil war, arises from that kind of blocking of action on an urgent matter that affects all groups. Calhoun made very clear that he did not intend this to be gridlock. He, in fact, said the opposite, that their action was urgent. And it was the very urgency of action that the negative consequences that would result for everybody, for all the interests, if there was not common agreement on some pressing issue that affected all of them, that would force them to come to agreement. So he did want compromise, not deadlock. He thought that this kind of high stakes brinkmanship of a minority interest, a powerful minority interest, blocking urgent legislation until it's revised to meet their standards and what they want. He did not see this as gridlock. He saw this as productive. And if you look at the outcome of the nullification crisis, which looked at certain points like it was going to lead to armed conflict between the federal government and the state of South Carolina, The outcome ultimately was a revised tariff downwardly revised tariff that was more or less satisfactory to all parties. And so Calhoun saw that as functional. So he saw this really high stakes invocation of what he argued was a constitutional state power to block federal law, federal court decisions, any federal action that a state was opposed to. He believed it was functional and that it led to compromise. It did lead to compromise in that case. It was also not the kind of crisis you want to go through every year. The other thing that I would say about Calhoun and compromise was that, and here you have to distinguish between the tariff issues and slavery, that Calhoun all along believed that the differences of economic interest between the North, the South, and the West could be compromised. He regarded the Northern manufacturers of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts as having legitimate interests that deserved consideration, but they were overreaching. They were writing legislation for the whole country that was exclusively in their own interest. And so the remedy was to force to a compromise between those two or three basic regional interests, all of which he saw as eminently capable of compromise. And once the compromise was reached, he went back to the state and toned down the people back in South Carolina who didn't want compromise. So he made the compromise, and then he was willing to go back and sell it to his own constituency. On the question of slavery, this is the problem. He said from the beginning, there was no compromise possible on this. So if you have a system that depends on compromise and you reject compromise, something is wrong. That's where you're heading toward deadlock or worse, secession or civil war, none of which Calhoun wanted. But there is this, I just believe, a massive disconnect. If his theory requires compromise and is intended to force different groups and interests to compromise, none of them can go in there saying that such and such and such is off the table from the beginning. And that's what slavery.
So yeah, and so that sort of takes me to the question I wanted to ask based on your comment, which was what was Calhoun and the South willing to compromise on if it wasn't willing to compromise on slavery? Was there some other dimension that he saw where there was an acceptable position for the South to give ground on something that would be acceptable to the North if it wasn't willing to compromise on slavery? Or was that just for him one of these inconsistencies that you got in a thinker of his caliber that you just can't resolve?
Well, I will describe what Calhoun believed was a compromise on slavery, which was, and now we're talking in the late 1840s up to his death in 1850, to run the Missouri Compromise line out to the Pacific, so that which would have the effect of dividing California, California was going to be, everyone knew, a massively important new state that would have divided California into a Northern California free state and the Southern California slave state. He saw that as a compromise. He actually considered it an unprincipled compromise because he believed that slaveholders had the right to bring their human property to any federal territory. So including federal territories north of that line, but he was willing to accept that running the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific as his version of a union-saving compromise, along with some other measures that he insisted upon. But if you believe that slavery is wrong, and also contrary to republicanism, which many people did, including many white Americans from free states who had no particular sympathy for blacks, but who saw the power that slavery gave a small group of people as being really dangerous and anti-Republican. You don't want that institution perpetuated. And so all of whatever compromises Calhoun proposed in the matter of slavery, they imagined it being perpetual in the United States, certainly in at least the southern half of it. And so if you're fundamentally opposed to slavery, that doesn't sound like a compromise either.
No, it does not. So one of you raised this question of sort of the lack of flexibility on the slave issue. One of the things that John Grove mentions in his essay, and a little bit about it in his interview, was his belief that Calhoun was not a very original thinker with regards to the defense of slavery, even though he adopted those defenses of slavery, and that he was basically taking sort of off-the-shelf philosophical arguments that people were making. Would you agree with John's position on that, or would you put yourself more in the camp of Jay Costa, someone who's saying, well, regardless of where he's getting this from, he's a pretty vocal defender of slavery, and we have to really kind of remember that when we consider the man as a whole. And I'll get to this more towards the end of the interview as well. So
actually, I would actually agree with both John and Jay on this.
That's a compromise.
It is, yeah. So I'm trying to model compromise here. It is true that whereas Calhoun was original and perceptive, and as a political theorist of lasting value, was in his diagnosis of how democratic politics, without violating any of the ordinary constitutional rules, can be systematically oppressive. As majorities and minorities become entrenched, the more, you're always in the majority or you're already in a minority, that how that could develop and become deeply oppressive, even if all your citizens still have voting rights, freedom of speech rights. So that is really an interesting and important finding. And I think it's anyone who's concerned about the health of our democracy, including people like me who are unpersuaded by Calhoun's proposed solution, I think you have to take that very seriously. And there's really no one other than Calhoun. Calhoun has developed that critique of how the dynamics of democratic processes could become systematically oppressive, especially in an extended republic. He developed that better than anyone else. He did, and this is where John Grove is right about, he did take the defenses of slavery, but the paternalistic defenses of slavery, the positive good ideas from other people. But Calhoun had and now I'm speaking of Calhoun as a political leader, a national figure. We can talk about whether to the degree this was separable from his theory, but as a political leader, he had a far greater national stature than anyone of those figures who generated those ideas about positive good defense of slavery. So that by the time you look at, with my current writing on Lincoln, looking at the secessionists and many of them reluctant secessionists, they were not thrilled about secession. This is true of Jefferson Davis. They looked to Calhoun. They looked to Calhoun for his, not only his analysis of the Constitution, but for his defense of slavery as being a positive good. It didn't matter that he didn't come up with it. He gave it, he helped to give a whole generation of Southern leaders a good conscience about an institution that, previous generations of Southern leaders had at least had qualms about. In that sense, I think that Calhoun does bear significant moral responsibility for the course that the United States took between mid 1830s and 1860. I would also, I think it's also important, this came up in our exchange about to what degree can you separate his political theory, political and constitutional theory, from his defense of slavery. And
let's hold off on that one until the end.
All right.
That's my last question, and I want to get to that one later. So we got to keep the viewers waiting. We got to, you got to keep people.
Okay.
Got to keep them viewing the whole way through. So in your view, as a sort of a megaphone, as someone who spreads an idea through the power of his, through the prestige that he has, but also through his ability to write, which was quite impressive, that he does take that, even though these are not original ideas, he publicizes them and he gives them a sort of broader audience, and that's an important point, and one that I don't think came up. Now, one thing that did come up in the essays briefly, and that you touched on as well, but nobody really got into quite substantially. People talked about nullification.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a bigger part of what people were interested in, but we didn't talk so much about concurrent majorities. And I was wondering if you could take a few minutes and tell our viewers what was Calhoun's idea about concurrent majorities and how it still is useful today. Keith talked about this a little bit in his interview, but if you could elaborate on that too, that'd be super.
Okay, well, so the basic idea of a concurrent majority, you have a concurrent majority in the regular Constitution at the national level because every piece of legislation has to pass both the House and the Senate. It's got to get a majority in both the House and the Senate. That's an example of a concurrent majority. That these majorities are constituted in different ways. The U.S. House is proportional to representation. The Senate is each state, regardless of size, has the same 2 senators. So that's an example of a concurrent majority that is in the federal Constitution. And from Calhoun's point of view, the fact that somewhat different interests were represented in those ways was part of the way that functioned within the federal Constitution. But what Calhoun did is then take that idea and drive it much, much further. The House and the Senate are both national bodies. None of them is controlled by any single state. What Calhoun did with the idea of a concurrent majority is to extend that to each state, the consent of each state being needed to pass legislation, or at least the consent, or at least not the objection that if the state did not raise an objection to legislation, then it could go forward as normal. And he believed that states would not invoke what he claimed was their constitutional right of nullification, except in appropriate extreme cases. Regardless of that, what then happens with the concurrent majority is that any legislation, national legislation that might adversely affect the state of South Carolina, or that the state of South Carolina believes may adversely affect it, would need to get a majority of the U.S. House and be supported by a majority of the Senate and be signed into law by the U.S. President, and then also be supported by the majority in a convention of South Carolina. If it is not supported by a majority in the convention of South Carolina, and Calhoun's procedure was to call a convention for the purpose of nullifying federal laws. If it did not win over a majority within each state in which that law was going to go into effect, it was nullified, at least within the borders of that state. So it's taking the idea of how many different majorities do you have to, how many hoops do you have to go through in the sense of different majorities each step along the way, much further, because there's one U.S. House, there's one Senate. Today there's 50 states. So there were 30 something in Calhoun's time. In principle, any one of which could have nullified any federal law it chose. Now, Calhoun left an escape clause, which is that if the other states who don't like South Carolina's nullification, or it's a single state's nullification, if they don't like it, they can call a constitutional convention and pass a constitutional amendment clarifying that this nullification is invalid, in which case that state would have to either withdraw its nullification or secede from the Union. Well, that's a process, first of all, totally outside of the actual normal Constitution. But second, it makes it almost impossible to actually overturn a single state's nullification. So what you actually have happening with South Carolina's nullification of the federal tariff is, in effect, the state of South Carolina making tariff policy for the entire country, because you can't have free open ports in Charleston and try to collect tariff duties in New York. You're just going to be sending all the trade then through the port of South Carolina. And so that is where it becomes, in my view, in the guise of seeking compromise and consensus, it really becomes a minority making laws for the rest of the country. And that's how James Madison saw it. Madison, was still alive during the nullification crisis. And when his Virginia resolutions of 1798 were being used to justify this, he went public and said, no, that's not what I meant then, and it's certainly not what I mean now.
Although it's interesting, several argued that perhaps it was more consistent with what Jefferson was saying in the Kentucky resolutions.
Yes, and I think even Madison recognized that there was certainly more legitimate support for nullification in Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, in particular his more radical draft of the Kentucky resolutions, than you get into the Virginia resolutions. You still have to ask, this is Jefferson's draft of the Kentucky resolutions is not the Constitution. So it's still worth asking why these documents, neither of which, Jefferson's draft of the Kentucky resolutions was too radical even for Kentucky, which toned it down. The Virginia resolutions, which Madison drafted and which passed the state of Virginia, which actually called for cooperation among the states rather than single state action. Well, the majority of states rejected that and had a different view. So in many ways, even if you take the way in which Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, the text of that certainly does talk about nullification, declaring laws null and void. And but the larger process, as I think maybe somebody pointed out, the outcome was to vote the scoundrels out of office. That it was a really high stakes way of building an electoral coalition and getting the Alien Sedition Acts repealed through the regular constitutional process. And that's, so it did not become the kind of standard ordinary mechanism that Calhoun envisioned, even for Jefferson. I think Jefferson saw that as really kind of an emergency act under dire circumstances, not something that could be a normal part of the constitutional legislative process. Whereas Calhoun saw this as something that could be normalized. And he also thought that if it was normalized, if this right of every state to object to federal laws and to block federal laws could be normalized and was always there, then you would rarely have to use it. States would rarely have to use it because members of Congress in doing their legislating would always take into account that could be done, and they would write their legislation in much more fair and restrained way.
It sounds a lot like the Articles of Confederation.
Well, yes. And this is the interesting thing. I won't have time to explain all this, but Calhoun in effect said the Articles of Confederation are still in effect. That the Constitution was a modification of the federal portion of the foundation laid by the Articles of Confederation. So he did not see the Constitution as having superseded the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution was a modification of the federal component of the power under the Articles of Confederation.
So it was, so is that because the states are ultimately where the sovereignty lies, and so they
it's ultimately not an empirical or historical argument. It's sort of a deductive argument based on, if your premise is that states are sovereign and that sovereignty can never be divided, then there would be no way to divide sovereignty and give some to the federal government and some to the states. And therefore, the federal government is, and now I have to mention that Calhoun earlier in his career did not talk this way. This is once he developed from the late 1820s on, he referred to the states as fully sovereign and the federal government as having no sovereignty in any way, shape, or form, because sovereignty cannot be divided. And it was for that reason that, in effect, each state being fully sovereign foundation of the Articles of Confederation, as far as Calhoun was concerned, was still in effect. But this is the thing, as I mentioned earlier, he thought this was functional. He didn't believe that, he didn't want it to guarantee deadlock. He believed it was functional to have a system where the federal government could act energetically, effectively, where needed, while retaining the support of every state and every important interest in the country. And, you know, to me, that's a very attractive but very utopian idea.
I think for someone who had the practical political experience that he had, it's either utopian or it's disingenuous. I mean, I find it really difficult to believe, and again, I'm going to defer to you as the Calhoun expert here because you are, but I find it difficult to believe that with all the experience he had, both in the executive and legislative branch, that he could honestly believe that that kind of governance could occur unless the ground had shifted so dramatically in the context of politics, in his view, that he simply no longer thought that the existing system was living up to the principles that he had originally thought it was intended to.
I do not see him as being disingenuous. I think he genuinely believed this. And you mentioned his historical experience, but of course, the most important experience that encouraged him to continue in this was the outcome of the 1830, the crisis over nullification in 1833, which led to a compromise that was good for all sides. So that one case, a very important case, you have to admit, became for him the model of how it could work. And he thought that for less important cases, ordinary legislation where there wasn't much at stake, states would restrain themselves and not invoke their weapon of nullification. I think you also can debate that. There's also all kinds of strategic ways that you can use a power to block action that you don't like. And I mean, another thing that I think is worth emphasizing is that blocking action tends to work to the advantage, not of all minorities, but of powerful, strategically placed minorities who are in a better position to wait out the results of stalemate.
So let's build on this. This is very interesting because I suggested that it's naive or disingenuous, and you say you don't think it was either, or at least it wasn't disingenuous. One of the things you mentioned in your essay that I think was really interesting at the end was this distinction between words and actions among all the political figures during this period. You point out that Calhoun saw a lot of the Northerners who had signed the Constitution as individuals who might be opposed to slavery but were willing to accept it. Talk about the differences between the people who did not own slaves and did own slaves in the way they acted and the way they played them, the way that sort of those actions played themselves out. Can you talk a little bit about some of these inconsistencies and contradictions during this period and how that might have helped Calhoun understand what he was thinking about in terms of concurrent majorities and nullification?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think let's go back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. I think that will help us both of whom were slaveholders.
Right.
Both Jefferson and Madison owned slaves their entire lives. Both of them clearly believed and argued publicly in print that slavery was a violation of natural right, that it was unjust, that at some point in the future it had to come to an end. Now, in Jefferson's case, there were also, racial assumptions. Jefferson had very many racist passages that he wrote, but even without that, in the absence of that, you didn't find that in Madison. Slavery is clearly something very difficult to get rid of. Whether Madison and Jefferson and their generation did as much to stop slavery as they could have is maybe debated. I would answer no. I mean, I think that Jefferson in particular had opportunities to halt the expansion of slavery when he was president. the Louisiana Purchase, which he did not take. But in any event, not only Jefferson and Madison, but that whole generation of Southern statesmen called slavery wrong, but in practice continued to expand it. The number of enslaved persons and continued to expand through that whole period. And so that's why I said at the end of my essay that when Calhoun calls to account Virginia Senator William Cabell Rives, who was a kind of follower of James Madison, admirer of James Madison, and Rives is saying basically what Madison and Jefferson did is that slavery is unjust. It's an evil, but under the current circumstances, an unavoidable evil. And Calhoun says, if you believe it's an evil, then you're duty bound to try to rid the country of it. So he's in effect calling them on their hypocrisy, or at least calling them out on the disjunction between their actions and their words, and forcing them to go one way or the other. Either own up to your slaveholding, don't continue claiming that you're have a tormented conscience to practice this institution that you practice every day just as much as I do. I mean, I'm putting words in his mouth here, but that's effectively what he's saying in that debate. Or, and if that's the case, then call it a positive good. That's what you really believe anyway. If you don't believe that, then join the abolitionists and their attack on our institutions. Which side are you on? That's in effect what he was saying. And so when he, although he didn't invent the theorizing of slavery being a positive good, I think he was in a uniquely positioned to use it in that kind of strategic way, to force his generation of Southern statesmen off the fence. And unfortunately, they went off the fence in Calhoun's direction, which was toward an increasingly unapologetic defense of slavery, and also not only the defense of slavery as an economic institution, but as slavery as giving every white person a pride and a status that they would not have without the institution of slavery. So it was slavery and white supremacy that he was explicitly defending. And you know, to concede to John Grove, his theory doesn't require these things. The theory in the disquisition on government doesn't require these things. However, you can't completely disconnect them, because in his political theory, as set forth in the disquisition, which says that every interest should have a right to this concurrent voice in whether in the making of laws, or a right to veto lawmaking that goes against them, you do have to ask who counts as an interest. And for Calhoun, it was self-evident that the minority, the minority that was interest that consisted of Southern slaveholders was an interest whose rights deserved consideration. African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not. Their interest did not count for anything. He took the paternalistic view that the slaveholders had their interest in mind. They don't need to be represented. They are people who are not prepared for liberty. So, you know, John in his book on Calhoun sees this as a big inconsistency, that Calhoun's practice was inconsistent with his theory here. I think you can make that argument. But still, if we're talking about Calhoun, the whole person, his whole life, he really pushed slavery as he called it, the safest and most stable basis for republicanism. He believed that it made Republican government safer than it was in the northern states. He believed that the pride of being a member of the white race gave slavery a value, especially for the non-slaveholding whites in the country. That the slaveholders had slaves, the non-slaveholders did not, but they still got to be part of this white aristocracy with this underclass below them. And that's all deeply disturbing. It also is it also mirrors so much of what is troubling in American history. And Calhoun did not resist it, did not even halfway resist it the way that you see with Jefferson and Madison. Calhoun seems never to have had any doubts about the justness of slavery. That's, to me, deeply disturbing, that a man that was so intelligent, public spirited in many ways, perceptive in his ability to diagnose the workings of a democracy and how it can become pathological, all which are of great value. But there is this great blindness in him that should be cause for reflection.
So that takes the question I kind of wanted to conclude everyone's interview with. You've already partially answered it. I think question number one is, can we separate out his slaveholding views with his political theory? And more generally speaking, during this climate in which we're debating whether or not certain authors and certain texts are beyond the pale and how we should address them, or whether we should simply stop reading these individuals because of the actions they engaged in, because of the things that they wrote and they believed. So the first part of the question is, should we read Calhoun moving forward, understanding the abhorrent views, understanding the blind spot, understanding the inconsistencies, understanding the moral challenges? And if so, are there still things of value in him that contemporary readers today, accepting all the horrible faults, can gain and can glean from his observations?
Well, obviously, our group would be an unrepresentative sample because we have all written on Calhoun, and I assigned Calhoun. Yes, I think he should be read. I don't believe he should be erased from the past. I don't object to renaming, Calhoun College in Yale University and Lake Calhoun in Minnesota. He did, however, help create the state of Minnesota when he was serving in James Monroe's administration. But I would say three things why you should read him. First of all, as I said earlier, his diagnosis of what can go wrong with democratic processes is very insightful and often accurate. Now, he thought he said this would always happen. Always majorities would become tyrannical and entrenched unless you had this right of nullification. I don't agree on the always part, but I think it clearly can happen. And anyone who's read and really thought about Calhoun, who looks at our contemporary politics, can see many of the pathologies that he talked about. And I think all of us in this exchange saw those things, that a majority that once it sees that it has the numbers and that it doesn't need to appeal to anybody's interest beyond itself, can lead to deeply unjust and politically dangerous and destabilizing conditions. That needs to be taken seriously. And now, if you don't take his remedy, if you reject his remedy, I said in my post that I see Calhoun as having lived like us in deeply polarized times, although they were worse, more polarized. And deeply polarized times, the temptation to want to just block what the other side is going to be able to do goes up and up. I don't see that as functional. I see that as a remedy worse than the disease. But if we reject that proposed remedy, it's not enough just to say, well, sure, he's got a good diagnosis of what can go wrong with democracy, but his remedy doesn't work, end of story. No, I think we then have a duty, both in our thinking and in our action, to try to make our democratic system work better, so that it so as to avoid the pathologies that he describes. And then the final, so for both of those reasons, and then the final reason that I think he is worth reading is that, for better or worse, he is a window on the crisis that led up to the Civil War. There's many different windows that we can draw from, but to me, I find Calhoun's life, the trajectory of his thought, in a certain sense, the tragic dimension of his life and his thought, to mirror the tragedy of the United States through that culminated in the Civil War. So, you know, you don't have to like him. You can condemn him. He certainly, you know, there's much to condemn in him in his defense of slavery, but don't deny yourself of a resource for understanding the country, for understanding what happened. I don't think all of American history is really important. It's many-sided and it's not simple. Simple narratives of our history, I don't think anyone coming from any political direction do any of us any good.
Well, that's a very, very powerful way to close this interview, but also the forum generally, because I think you're absolutely right. And what he provides us with is an opportunity to understand what that other side was thinking about, but also to take a long look at ourselves and to understand sort of how we might want to pull back and where we want to draw lines and limits on our own behavior in order to maintain the union and think about what the limits of decency and civility really are. So, James, I want to thank you very much for your time, for a very, very lively set of your essays and responses, but also a very, very lively interview. Thanks for taking the time to be in the author interviews and also participating in this forum at Liberty Matters.
Thank you so much. It's been very good and very interesting.
It's been super. Thanks again.